In this next chapter, we're going to look at ethics, which is important for a number of reasons within this paper. For example, ethics is another way of managing risks. And ethics as well can be a source of risks for organizations. Now, to understand how ethics apply in particular to our profession, it's important to understand CIMA's ethical code, and we'll look in turn at the 5 principles that make up that code and what they mean. We're also going to have a look at how you might resolve ethical issues that you come across in the exam or indeed in real life, and steps you can go through to make sure you come to a reasonable conclusion. Let's start this chapter by looking at ethics in general and why they're important in this paper. In general terms, ethics are a set of moral principles that guide behaviour, and as such we use them all the time. In P3, they form part of the context of risk management and controls, and later on we'll look at this term, the control environment. That is the background against which we assess risks and controls, and ethics form part of that background. In addition, ethics may be a source of risk. For example, if a company is found to have acted unethically, it may damage their brand, their reputation, and their business as a whole. Now, CIMA's principles are very clear that the professional accountant has a duty of care to their client if they're giving any sort of advice, and also to their employer. But they also have a duty of care to society. Society puts certain trust in professional accountants, and it's very, very important that we live up to that trust and don't abuse it. Now, just a word about how this may be examined. You may see exam questions focusing on the ethical principles that are particularly relevant for accountants. For example, presenting financial information fairly. But you may also see questions about general ethical issues facing organizations. For example, those relating to fair trade or treatment of employees. Now, in those situations, accountants are expected to give a clear ethical lead to their organizations, as professionals and as people who take ethics seriously. Just to mention in passing also that ethics are a very important part of your assessment at P10, so it's worth understanding this clearly now. It's very important that you understand CIMA's ethical principles. Apart from any other reason, they apply to you as registered students. They're reasonably easy to remember using the mnemonic PIPCO. The first of the ethical principles is that of professional behaviour. And what this is about is not bringing the profession into disrepute. We need to behave in a way that maintains the high reputation of qualified accountants. For example, we need to treat our colleagues and anyone we deal with courtesy. We perhaps may need to maintain our temper in difficult situations and generally deal with people in the way they would expect of a professional. The second principle is that of integrity, and this is really about honesty. It means that we behave always in a way that is honest, we don't lie, we don't cover things up, we tell the truth. The third principle is that of professional competence and due care, and what this means is that we must be competent to do what we are asked to do, whether that's by a client or by an employer. So it's up to us to make sure we have the skills to do our job. If we need training in a certain area, we need to go and find it and make sure we get it. If we need certain experience, we need to make sure we get that experience. And if that's not practical and we're asked to do something that is really outside our field of expertise, we need to say so. We need to tell our client or employer that we're not the right person to do this, and they need to go and find an expert. And then, having taken on the work, we need to do it with due care. We need to do it to the best of our ability. The consequence if we did work that wasn't done to the best of our ability, or that we weren't competent to do, is that we will do poor quality work, and that will impact the reputation of all qualified accountants. The fourth principle is that of confidentiality, and that is about keeping sensitive information private. Accountants, by the nature of their job, are very often privy to sensitive data which must not become public for commercial or perhaps even for compliance reasons. We will not disclose that information inappropriately, and that's why we're going to be trusted with the information in the first place. And then the final principle is that of objectivity, and that is about being able to maintain a detached viewpoint. We need to be able to form a professional judgment without taking account, for example, of our personal likes or dislikes or our personal circumstances. We need to take an objective view of a situation and come to a judgment that is independent. Having looked at the key ethical principles, the ethical guidelines set out also some of the fundamental situations that could threaten those principles, and it's worth being aware of these so you can look out for them in a scenario. They can be arranged to form the mnemonic as-ifs: advocacy, self-interest, intimidation, familiarity, and self-review. These are at least partly self-explanatory, so have a go at the next lecture example, which requires you to match up each of those threats to the definition. So let's see how we did matching the threats to the definitions. The first definition is the threat of familiarity. An example of this might be where we make a business decision that favours a relative or a close friend in a way that's inappropriate and perhaps not in the interests of the company as a whole. The second definition is the threat of self-interest. And this is where, for example, we might feel tempted to act in a way that is unethical in order to promote our career or perhaps to receive a bigger bonus. The third definition is the threat of advocacy. And an example of this might arise if we were to make misleading statements, for example, in order to support our employer's goals, where those goals perhaps aren't reasonable. The fourth definition is that of self-review, and an example of this might occur perhaps if the person who was preparing data for a business case was the same person as the one making the decision about the business case. And the final definition is the threat of intimidation. And this may occur perhaps if we are being threatened with dismissal, if we don't act in a way that we consider to be unethical. So what can organisations do to reduce these threats and encourage ethical behaviour? See if you can take a few minutes to think about this and come up with perhaps 3 or 4 practical ideas. In practice, there are lots of things organisations can do, and these are just meant to be a few examples. One thing they might do is perhaps adopt a code of practice. That doesn't mean that everyone in the organisation will adhere to the code of practice, but it does at least set a standard. It shows what they are aspiring to. A company or an organisation can adopt a strict recruitment policy, aiming to screen out people, for example, who have criminal records, or who have a record of being dishonest in their application. Companies can aim to set a good tone from their leadership, sometimes referred to as tone from the top. If the senior managers are seen to be acting in an ethical way, talking about the importance of ethics and behaving in that way, then that will have an impact on the whole organisation. Organisations may have a formal policy that offers protection for whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are people who see something going wrong in the organisation and want to talk about it, and perhaps they meet with obstruction from their line manager. Some companies have a telephone line that whistleblowers can call and report their concerns. And finally, if organisations are serious about ethics, they will introduce disciplinary action for ethical breaches. It's very important that if someone is found to be acting unethically, for example receiving or giving bribes, that they are dealt with seriously and the incident isn't swept under the carpet. The next section introduces you to a number of steps that you can use to analyse ethical issues in the exam. Have a read through those steps, and then have a read through the lecture example. See if you can use the steps to analyse the issue in the lecture example at ABC Limited. Write down some notes about what the key issues are and how you would use the ethical principles to guide you to a decision. See if you can conclude on what you would do, and most importantly, why you would do it. So how would we deal with this? Well, let's apply the steps. Firstly, we want to identify the key facts. The key point here is that there have been payments made and we have no support for those payments. So from the point of view of the accountant that we're taking in the scenario, we don't know if the payments are unethical or illegal. You do need to be a little bit careful about the terminology you use, by the way. There is some evidence, perhaps, suggesting that bribes may be paid here, but we don't really have any evidence of that, so you would need to express that view very, very carefully. The second step is to identify the relevant ethical issues and fundamental principles. The issue here is that we may be complicit in unethical activity. We may be being part of something that is wrong. And the key ethical principles that we might identify perhaps are integrity, because we are being asked to make a false representation to the auditors. It seems that we're being asked to represent that these payments are legitimate, when in truth we don't know if they're legitimate or not. The second principle you could identify here is professional competence and due care. Part of our job as an accountant in this situation is to make sure we know what each payment is and that it's being accounted for correctly. As things stand, we are not able to do our job. And we might also add in here, perhaps, professional behaviour. If this matter at some point becomes public, it may bring the profession into disrepute. In terms of the key threats that we might identify here, perhaps there's self-interest, because we're being told that if we want to keep our job and do well at the organisation, we should keep quiet about these payments, and perhaps intimidation. There is an implied threat that someone who asks questions might not be treated very well in the organisation. So that's our analysis of the key issues. What are the alternatives? What are the things we could do? Well, there are actually a number of situations here. What we could do is take no action. We might decide that actually, if our bosses aren't concerned about these payments, then we shouldn't be too, and we have no real evidence that anything wrong is happening. Perhaps we could talk to the finance director or to another member of senior management to raise our concerns, but clearly there is some risk that that will have adverse consequences. Perhaps we could resign and not tell anyone what's going on. That way, we're not getting involved in these transactions. However, we don't perhaps want to jeopardise the reference that our employer will give if we look for another job. Now, in each of these situations, certainly if you were in the UK, you would maybe have to consider a legal issue to do with money laundering. It's just an aside, but in the UK, if you have suspicions of money laundering, you are required to report them to the authorities without letting the people involved know that you're talking to the authorities. So those are our possibilities. Now when you get to 4, I'm going to say there isn't a right answer, because very often in ethics there isn't. There are a number of different possibilities, and actually you could defend any of the 3 points above. But what you need to do is make sure that you do point 5, which is to justify your recommendation. You would have to include a because to support your judgment. Now in the exam, the ethical resolution may be a bit more clear-cut than that, but I did want to make the point there is usually no one correct answer for these situations. Okay, so let's just recap this short chapter. The key points coming out of here are firstly that you must know the 5 ethical principles in CIMA's ethical guidelines. Just to remind you, they are professional behaviour, integrity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and objectivity. Remember, these apply to you as a registered student of CIMA. They are also expected to be the basis of any solutions or advice you give in the exam. You must also be able to apply these principles. The way this is by far the most likely to be tested is that within some scenario there will be an ethical issue that you will be required to analyse and resolve. In which case, you're going to refer back to the 5 principles and you're going to argue your case for what you think the right course of action is.